You know, with this cover on these goggles, I can't see all the work my wife wants me to do for her. Oh boy, wishful thinking. Hi guys, how's it going, eh? Todd, the cheap drums guy. With another little story for you. Just kind of playing with my Kevlar ACH Mitch helmet that I got when I retired. This is the one I wore on my last deployment, and luckily I was able to take it with me. It's a nice little keepsake. Excuse my Mountain Dew, but I was reminded of a story the other day about an incident that happened. I believe it was in 1996 during a Middle East deployment we called Operation Intrinsic Action. Now, what Intrinsic Action was a show of force to Saddam Hussein, who at that time was still in power. It wasn't until 2003 that we got him. But every year, the U.S. Army would send a brigade or two from all the heavy divisions down to Kuwait. They would draw vehicles and equipment that were pre-positioned by us from Desert Storm, and you'd head out to the desert to possibly sit there and wait and combat Iraqi forces again if they've made another move. Well, we were, I think, pretty much at the end of this deployment, and the Kuwaitis wanted to bring out a little of their macho-ness, and so they had asked us to build them a live fire range. And the live fire range would consist of, we would have to bring in wrecked Iraqi vehicles from Desert Storm, like mainly tanks and stuff, you know, the heavier equipment, and armored personnel carriers and stuff. And then we'd set up 55-gallon drums that were to be filled with diesel fuel, so that when they're shot, they'll not explode, but they'll nice big fiery impact. So here we are on this day building this range. The bleachers and the overhead cover were set up over here, but we were out doing the stuff on the range itself for the tanks to come through and make a mess for everybody, and they could clap, and you know, the Kuwaitis can look at me, I'm cool. And so, well, the Kuwaitis would be, they were going to be using Yugoslav-made M84 tanks, which are a Yugoslav copy of the Russian T-72 types, and they're arguably better than the Russian tanks. And then they would also be using British Warrior armored personnel carriers, which was a fine system. So anyways, I was there with a squad of guys. We had a Humvee, a troop carrier Humvee, you know, with a covered driver and co-driver seat, and then the back was open, like a pickup truck in the United States. And generally, when you're in the Army down there, traveling around Kuwait at this time, you carried on the vehicle, well actually all the Allies did, you carried on the vehicle a big, huge, like 2 or 3 foot by 6 foot nylon panel that was international orange in color. What we call a hunter's orange here in the United States. Very bright. It's called a VS-17. And we carried it for a reason, because of the zoomies up in the air. Because the Allied Air Forces are always on patrol. We're always on patrol. Especially, you know, like the British Panavia Tornado pilots. I love those guys. The Tornadoes were they were the funnest ones to watch. Those guys would do all sorts of crazy stuff. But you also had American F-15s, F-16s, and the Fairchild Republic A10 Warthog 2, which, if you knew those were up in the air, you knew you were going to sleep good that night. You didn't have to worry about anything, because the A10's badass, despite what the Air Force says about them. But anyways, so we pretty much finished up what we had to do at the range that we were building for the Kuwaitis and whatnot. So we were milling about our Humvee. We were on the range still. Probably there was a wreck tank probably 50 yards over here, and there was another one there, and a burn barrel over here. And we were having our lunch. You know, I had our MREs and stuff like that. And what do you do when you're pretty much run out of work to do, and You just eaten? Of course, you take a nap, take a little siesta. So on the back of this Hummer, we always carried our gear wherever we went. And so the Hummer, we had all our gears back there and the VS-17 panel over top of it. And the guys decided they're going to take a little nap, so they laid down. Now, we made a mistake. We should have taken that VS-17 panel, taken it off the gear, and put it on the roof of the Humvee. But we didn't. And the guys at the time didn't think about it either, because planes have been going back and forth overhead for quite some time. And, you know, nothing happened, of course. So the guys decided to take a nap, and they lay down on top of the VS-17 panel. 4 of them sprawled out on the back, and it unfortunately covered the entire panel. No biggie, you know, at the time we thought. But anyways, another guy, another Desert Storm vet, and I were sitting there talking. We called him Sloth, and just milling about the Humvee, and we heard A10s coming, which is no biggie. You know, A10s are flying up there all the time. And we were having our conversation, and we watched them fly overhead, and didn't think nothing of it. And then a minute later, we kind of noticed that they did a right hook. There, I can't remember. I couldn't tell you the altitude, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 feet or something. But they banked back towards us. Again, not thinking anything about it. And then he came into a shallow dive. Now when the A10 uses its GAU-8 30mm cannon, it comes in on like a 20 degree, 25 degree downslope, and then lights into you with that gun. And we saw him, the first pilot, come in to do that, and we didn't think nothing of it, you know, at first still. Because generally, when was the last time an A10 ever fired at you? Never. So again, we didn't think that much of it. And Sloth turns around, and we both seemed to get a bad feeling at that time. And just then, the front of that plane was kind of engulfed in a little bit of black smoke. We knew what that was. The pilot came in and was targeting one of the tanks that we had set up, or we had put in a position. And no sooner did we start to run than the round started impacting on that vehicle. The rounds that hit the ground, most of the rounds were hitting the tank, of course, but there was several, or quite a bit, that was actually hitting the ground around it, and you felt every one of them through the ground. And we're like 50 yards away still. I mean, we were a good little distance. So safe, well, not technically safe really, but and then when that happened, the guys on the back of the Humvee were 5 feet in the air, and they were following us because we were running our ass off. We were running away from the impact zone. Just, oh my God, it was just crazy. The noise was ear-splitting. And so we got clear of the Humvee, and when those guys came off the Humvee, of course that VS-17 panel was exposed. The A10 immediately ceased fire and banked up. He rolled on past, and his wingman, who was also looked like he was lining up to fire behind him, pulled up as well and went by us. The lead A10, the one that actually fired, banked around and came back low. I mean, he was at camel top level, and he came in low and slow just to see us. So he went by, and we could see him plain as day in that aircraft. He went by and he went, you know, to give us a thumbs up to see if we were okay, and we all respond, you know, thumbs up. And then he waggled his wings, and then his buddy came and wagged his wings and went past us. And then at that point, well, what we should have done was gotten the hell off the range anyways, because they probably figured we were going to be done by a certain time anyways, because we were just wrapping things up, and then we'd clear the range. But this was the first time this is the first and only time in 23 years in the Army that I saw a lack of communication between the Army and the Air Force. Because generally the Army would call the Air Force, you know, at this time, say, okay, that range is open to clear, you know, whatever, if you guys need to go use it. Or the Air Force would call the Army and say, hey, we're coming in, can we use the range? But for the strangest moment, there was a lapse of communication between the two, and it really could have been bad. And again, that's the only time I ever saw it in the military. But then again, something like that only needs to happen once to have a really, really bad day. But at that point, we got ourselves together. The Air Force got on, or the A10 pilots got on the horn with the Air Force and said, hey, the Army's got people working down there. So the Air Force calls the Army, you know, everybody calls each other back and forth. And not trying to put blame on anybody, but they're just trying to find out what's going on, if anybody got hurt. And because we care about our troops, and the Air Force cares about the Army guys too, and vice versa. But anyway, so we beat feet out of there and went back to our camp and gave them a rundown of what has actually happened, and told them, you know, it was a almost friendly fire incident, and that all 6 personnel were safe, and that we had, you know, ensured the pirates that we were all right. And the pilots, excuse me, when we got back to our camp, the pilots had already inquired through the Air Force to call them, our unit, to check on us individually if we were all right. I mean, the pilot was really concerned, and that made me feel pretty good. And when they asked, you know, how we were doing, and it's like, you know, we're fine, we're okay, you know. We said, nice shooting, by the way, you know, you hit the target really well. And they kind of got a kick out of that. And they'd send us something over afterwards, a little present of something to say they're sorry. Again, it wasn't really their fault. It was probably our fault for not, well, had we not covered the BS-17 panel, they would have known we were still there and the range wasn't hot yet. So, but that's my little story of almost friendly fire in the Middle East with the wonderful Fairchild Republic A10 Warthog 2. And you never, ever want to be on the receiving end of that thing when it fires at you. You're going to have a really bad day. But I'm Todd, the cheap drums guy, and that was story number 3. Have a good day, people.